And welcome back. If you recall, in our previous lesson, we talked about how to use reference images in order to help us create pixel art or to act as a guide that can help us have a much more detailed or rich image, or even just to use for practice. Now, though, that we are starting to shift gears into making more of our own images, let's look at a couple things when we start talking about specifications, especially for pixel art. So the very first thing you have to understand when we're dealing with pixel art is that a lot of times we're working to our own specifications, or we have specifications laid out before us. And those specifications might be things like certain colors, might be the size of an image. Think about the images we've done. We've done, like, for example, we start with 8 by 8, that's a specification. 16 by 16 pixels, that's a specification. Using certain colors and using color theory to help complement things, those are all specifications that we can use. And sometimes when you're doing a certain pixel artwork, or even artwork in general, you're often working within a certain color palette, which we'll talk about more later, that you're going to be using for that image. The important thing more than anything else, though, is that consistency is key. And this is because you don't want your image, especially if you're working in a set of images, to really start to jar against one another. So for example, let's say you make an image that uses a lot of blues and greens, but then you make something that uses a lot of reds and yellows. Unless those images aren't going to necessarily be working with one another, you could have kind of a jarring effect for anyone that's visually looking at your images. Now, if you can incorporate those in such a way that it works within your color palette, great. But the most important thing here is that consistency from one image to another, especially when you're working on some kind of project, is crucial. The next thing to kind of discuss, though, is that of using binary choice in order to guide your design. And this is a good thing to kind of think about from a high level. So what do I mean when I say binary choice? Well, binary choice means you're picking one of two options. So, for example, if we look at something and we're asking, is it realistic or is it iconized? Realistic obviously means we're going for something much more photorealistic. We're looking for accurate proportions. We're looking for things that we could see in real life. Even in a pixel art setting, we're going to say, for example, when we make a pixel art representation of a person, for example, they'll have realistic proportions, for example, between head, legs, stuff like that. Or are we going for something more iconized? For example, maybe we're making a fantasy setting and we're going to draw our characters with huge muscles that are well beyond what would normally be used. So they're wielding weapons that are so large that we realistically in our world wouldn't be able to pick them up, let alone swing. Again, an iconized effect. Are we looking at something that is more 2D in nature or 3D in nature? 2D is obviously what we're wheelhouses right now. We're dealing with pixel art. But 3D effects can also kind of make their way into even pixel art a little bit. So are we looking for something that's very flat in their image? Or are we adding dimension where we can feel the distance between one figure and another? Are we doing a transparent or filled background? And it doesn't necessarily have to be restricted to the background. It could be even certain elements of a character. For example, think about if you've ever watched Harry Potter, he's using his invisibility cloak. His invisibility cloak makes him transparent, right? So if you had a pixel art of that, when he has the cloak on, you might have some sort of effect around the cloak, but underneath that cloak, everything's going to be transparent. We could have seen some of this a little bit when we started looking at creating our images. So far, we've done a lot of images with a filled background. We might have done just a solid white color, or maybe we did like a gradient style effect. These are all design choices that can dictate how a final image looks. Additionally, are we using shading? Is it going to be flat shading, or is it going to be more realistic? Remember, a realistic shading effect will have different tones and dimensions to the shadow. They'll be able to shift based upon where the character is standing. It's not just a flat black line. Are we going for more of square edge or rounded corners on our pixel art? What that means is, for example, when we look at our pixel art, are our edges hard? Are they these sharp points when we look at it? Or are we using something like from software or some other design, or just creating pixel art that has much more smoother, softer edges, so it's much more visually aesthetically pleasing? You could still go for the square edge look because maybe that's the design you're doing, but these again are two different choices. Now, one thing I want you to understand though is whatever happens, it is okay to bend the rules. So we talked, of course, about having consistency. Yes, consistency is great and it's very important. But sometimes you're going to bend those rules just a little bit. You're going to do things like, hey, you know what, my specifications might call for a 16 by 16 image. Well, I'm going to go above and beyond. I'm going to do a 32 by 32, and then I can scale that accordingly. Or maybe I'm going to, work with a different color palette that is going to be a little bit more. It might not be exactly what I'm looking for, but it might have most of that color palette, and then work a little bit around that. Things such as that. It's okay to bend those rules. You don't have to be locked into the rules, but it is okay to bend them. And that's going to wrap up what we have to say today about specifications. Now, keep these things in mind as you start your journey of making your own image.